Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be exploring kind of a hypothetical scenario, It's causing a bit of a stir in education.
Oh, yeah.
So how potential policy changes could impact, like, some of our most vulnerable students, right? Those who are English learners and have disabilities.
Yeah, it's a hot button issue for sure, and one that deserves careful consideration.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And our guide for this deep dive is an opinion piece called Ignoring the Elephant in the Classroom. The author really digs into two proposed sets of policies, Agenda 47 and Project 2025. But before we get into the specifics, I want to emphasize something. Like, our goal here is to understand the author's perspective, and the
Yeah,
potential consequences they're outlining. We're not endorsing any particular political stance.
yeah,
Just think of us as your impartial deep dive buddies.
exactly, exactly. Exploring the ideas and potential implications, just laid out in this opinion piece.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. The author of this piece, they work in a high poverty school, right?
Right.
And is deeply concerned about the potential impact of Agenda 47 and Project 2025. They see these policies as part of what they call a neoliberal strategy. Essentially, the idea that market forces should guide education, leading to less government involvement.
Right. And a key element of this strategy is the proposed elimination of the Department of Education and a shift towards what's often called school choice. The author is particularly worried about the impact this could have on funding.
So instead of federal oversight and funding, we'd be looking at a system where, like, individual states have more control
Exactly.
over education.
And that's where the author sees a big red flag. They're concerned that this could lead to even greater funding disparities between states and school districts.
Okay, I can see where that would be a problem, right?
Yeah.
Some states might prioritize education funding more than others, leaving some students with fewer resources. Yeah. But what's the author's, biggest fear when it comes to this privatization push?
They're particularly concerned about the potential for what they call cherry picking by charter schools.
Cherry picking mountain.
Yeah. In a system where schools have more autonomy, they argue that charter schools might be more likely to select students,
Oh, okay.
who are easier to educate, potentially leaving behind those with greater needs.
That's a tough point to argue with, but don't charter school advocates often say that they offer more choice and innovation in education?
hmm
How does the author address that?
They acknowledge that argument, but they counter that choice without equity isn't really choice at all.
Right.
They believe that a system that truly values choice needs to ensure that all students have access to high-quality educational options, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of their background or needs.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got funding concerns,
hmm
potential issues with equity.
Right.
What else is the author worried about?
They're also very critical of Agenda 47's stance on diversity and inclusion initiatives. They see this as part of a larger attempt to control the narrative in classrooms and limit critical conversations about things like race, gender, and identity.
So essentially they're saying Agenda 47 is pushing a specific and, some might say limited view of what it means to be American.
Precisely. The author uses pretty strong language here, referring to Agenda 47 as a neo-colonialist project, meaning they see it as an attempt to impose a single dominant culture on everyone.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was in school, we had this one history textbook that completely glossed over the experiences of Native Americans. It was like their history just didn't matter. It's disturbing to think that we might be heading back in that direction.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The author draws parallels to historical examples of using education to enforce assimilation, particularly the forced assimilation of indigenous children in boarding schools where their languages and cultures were suppressed.
It's a pretty chilling comparison. So the author sees this push for a homogenous culture as, not only unfair, but also potentially harmful.
Yes, they argue that by pushing for a narrow definition of American identity, Agenda 47 risks erasing the contributions and experiences of diverse student populations. And that's not just unfair, it's a loss for everyone.
Okay, so we've got concerns about funding,
Yeah.
equity, and cultural erasure. Where do things go from here?
Well, the author then turns their attention to a specific government agency, the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR.
And what's the OCR's role in all this?
The OCR plays a vital role in enforcing protections for students who might face discrimination or barriers to accessing education, including English learners and students with disabilities.
So if Agenda 47 passes, What happens to the OCR?
That's the scary part. The proposal actually calls for eliminating the OCR entirely.
Wait, so there would be no federal agency responsible for protecting the rights of these students?
That's the author's concern. They argue that without the OCR, there would be no one to ensure that schools are providing equitable access to education for all students, or to hold schools accountable for discriminatory practices.
I can see why the author's worried. It sounds like eliminating the OCR could have a huge impact on students with disabilities. What happens to the support that they rely on?
Yeah, that's a big question mark. There's been talk of shifting oversight of things like individualized education programs, or IEPs, to the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, but it's unclear how that would work in practice.
So instead of the Department of Education overseeing support for students with disabilities, it would be HHS.
That's the idea.
Yep.
But the author points out that HHS is already stretched thin managing health-related programs,
Right.
taking on this massive and it's not clear if they have the expertise or the resources to do it effectively.
That's a valid concern. Education and healthcare are two very different fields.
Exactly. And the author worries that this shift could lead to delays or even denials of services for students with disabilities.
Okay, so we've talked about funding,
Mhm.
equity, cultural representation, and the potential loss of the OCR. What about the specific needs of English learners? Where do they fit into all of this?
That's where things get even more complicated. The author is particularly concerned about the potential impact on Title III funding, which currently supports English language development programs.
And what's the concern with Title III funding?
Under Agenda 47, there's a possibility that Title III funding could be drastically reduced or even eliminated, and that could have a ripple effect on language learners across the country.
So instead of consistent federal support for English language learners, we'd be looking at a situation where some states prioritize language support while others don't.
Exactly. We could end up with a patchwork system where access to quality language programs is determined by your zip code, and that's something the author sees as a huge step backward.
Yeah. It almost feels like we're going back to like a sink or swim mentality, when it comes to language learning.
That's a good way to put it. And the author points out that this runs counter to all the research we have about the benefits of bilingual and multilingual education.
So in an ideal world, what would the author like to see happen, instead of all of this?
Well, I think that's something we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive. But what's clear is that the author is deeply concerned about the direction things are heading.
Definitely a lot to unpack here. Let's take a closer look at some of these potential consequences and explore what alternatives the author might propose after a quick break. All right, we're back and ready to continue our deep dive into this opinion piece on Agenda 47 and Project 2025. Before the break, we were talking about the potential impact on Title III funding.
Right.
And how that could create like an uneven playing field for English learners.
And this unevenness really ties into the author's concern about an austerity-focused approach to education.
So what does that mean exactly? An austerity-focused model?
Essentially, it means prioritizing cost-cutting and efficiency above all else. And in that kind of environment, programs like bilingual education often get seen as expendable luxuries,
Right.
rather than essential investments.
I see. Yeah, I see the author's point. Like, if the main focus is on cutting costs, then programs that support diverse learners might be the first to go.
Exactly. And the author argues that this is short-sighted
Okay.
because bilingual and multilingual programs have been shown to have all sorts of benefits for students, right?
Right.
Not just in terms of language acquisition, but also cognitive development and cultural understanding.
It's like they're saying that valuing diversity actually makes us smarter and stronger as a society.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And this idea of valuing diversity really gets to the heart of the author's critique of Agenda 47. They argue that it reflects a very specific and, frankly, troubling mindset.
What kind of mindset are we talking about here?
They call it a colonial mindset, meaning a way of thinking that prioritizes assimilation over cultural preservation. It's about imposing a single dominant culture rather than embracing the richness of different languages and traditions.
That connects back to what we were talking about earlier with the, potential for cultural erasure.
Exactly. The author sees Agenda 47 as part of a larger historical pattern of using education as a tool to homogenize society.
And they see this as particularly harmful to indigenous and immigrant populations.
Yes, they argue that these groups have historically been the most targeted by assimilationist policies, and that Agenda 47 represents a continuation of that harmful trend.
So how does this colonial mindset actually play out in the specifics of Agenda 47?
Well, one example the author points to is the emphasis on parental rights.
How do parental rights fit into this?
The author argues that the rhetoric of parental rights is often used to justify limiting what students are exposed to in the classroom,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to topics like race, gender, and sexuality.
So it's like using the idea of parental rights as a shield to prevent students from like encountering diverse perspectives.
Exactly. And the author sees this as a way of controlling the narrative
Yeah.
and limiting students' ability to think critically about the world around them.
But wouldn't some people argue that parents have a right to, have a say in what their children are learning?
Absolutely. And the author acknowledges that parental involvement in education is important, but they argue that it shouldn't come at the expense of students' access to a well-rounded and inclusive education. They believe that true parental empowerment comes from equipping students with the knowledge, and critical thinking skills to navigate a complex world, not from shielding them from it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about finding a balance
Right.
between respecting parental concerns and ensuring that students are exposed to, a wide range of ideas
Right.
and perspectives.
Exactly. And the author argues that Agenda 47 tips the scales too far in one direction, prioritizing a narrow and often exclusionary worldview over the needs of diverse learners.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about funding, equity, cultural erasure, the role of the OCR, the potential impact on English learners, and this idea of a colonial mindset. Is there anything else the author highlights as like a major concern with Agenda 47?
Well, they also point out the way Agenda 47 uses the language of patriotism to promote its goals.
Oh.
They argue that Agenda 47 often frames its proposals as being in the best interest of the nation,
Okay.
suggesting that anyone who opposes these policies is somehow unpatriotic.
And that seems like a pretty loaded tactic.
It is, and the author sees this as a way of silencing dissent and shutting down debate. They argue that true patriotism involves engaging in thoughtful and critical discussions about how to make our country better for all its citizens, not blindly accepting policies that benefit a select few.
It sounds like the author is concerned about the potential for Agenda 47 to, create divisions and stifle critical thinking.
Yes, and they see this as a threat to the very fabric of our democracy. They argue that a healthy society needs to be able to have open and honest conversations about its challenges, and to consider a variety of perspectives in order to find solutions.
So essentially they're saying that Agenda 47 represents like a narrowing of the conversation rather than an expansion of it.
But that's a good way to put it. And they argue that this narrowing of perspective ultimately harms everyone, not just those who are directly targeted by these policies.
A powerful argument and one that definitely gives us a lot to think about. So we've talked about the author's concerns about Agenda 47 and Project 2025. What about solutions? Do they offer any alternatives or ways to address these issues?
That's a great question, and one we'll delve into as we continue our deep dive.
We've spent a lot of time unpacking the author's concerns about Agenda 47 and Project 2025.
Right.
But it's not all doom and gloom, is it? The author surely has some ideas about what a better path forward might look like.
Absolutely, yeah. Remember the title of this opinion piece, Ignoring the Elephant in the Classroom? The author's central point is that we can't just ignore the needs of diverse learners.
Right.
We have to actively address them.
So what does that look like in practice? What kind of solutions does the author propose?
Well, they don't lay out a detailed policy plan, but they do offer some guiding principles. One of the key things they emphasize is the importance of investing in public education and ensuring that resources are distributed equitably.
So instead of cutting funding and shifting towards privatization, the author believes we should be putting more resources into public schools.
Exactly.
Especially those serving high-need students.
They argue that strong public schools are essential for a thriving democracy and that we need to prioritize funding for things like teacher training, smaller class sizes, and programs that support English learners and students with disabilities.
That makes sense. It's hard to argue that we should be taking resources away from public education when there are so many schools struggling to, meet the needs of their students.
Right. And the author also stresses the need for policies that promote diversity and inclusion, not just in terms of curriculum, but also in terms of school culture and climate.
So how do we create schools that truly value and celebrate diversity?
Yeah.
What kinds of, concrete steps can we take?
The author suggests things like recruiting and retaining more diverse teachers, providing professional development on culturally responsive teaching practices, and creating opportunities for students to, learn about and engage with different cultures.
Sounds like they're advocating for a much more holistic approach to education,
Hmm.
one that goes beyond just academics
Right.
and focuses on, the whole child.
That's right. And they also emphasize the importance of student voice and agency in this process. They argue that students should have a say in shaping their own education and that their perspectives and experiences need to be valued and respected.
So instead of imposing a single top-down vision of education, we should be creating more space for students to share their ideas
Hmm.
and contribute to the learning process.
Exactly. And the author believes that this kind of participatory approach is essential for creating schools that are truly equitable and empowering for all students.
It's inspiring to hear someone who's so passionate about, creating a better future for education, even in the face of these challenging proposals.
I agree. And I think it's important to remember that the author of this opinion piece is not alone. There are countless educators, families, and advocates across the country who are fighting for a more just and equitable education system.
So where do we go from here? What can we do, as individuals to support these efforts?
Well, one of the most important things is to stay informed and engaged,
Okay.
learn about the issues, talk to your elected officials, support organizations that are working to advance educational equity, and most importantly, listen to the voices of students and families who are directly impacted by these policies.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
It can feel overwhelming to think about tackling these big, systemic issues.
Right.
But remembering that our individual actions can make a difference is, empowering.
Absolutely. And I think this deep dive has really highlighted how much is at stake when it comes to education policy. It's not just about abstract ideas, it's about real lives
Yeah.
and real futures.
We've seen how these proposed policies could have profound impact
Mm.
on English learners, students with disabilities, and really any student who doesn't, fit neatly into a narrow definition of what it means to be American.
And we've been challenged to think critically about the kind of education system we want to create. One that embraces diversity, values equity, and empowers all students to reach their full potential.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But I think it's a conversation worth having.
I agree. And I hope this deep dive has given you the information and inspiration you need to join that conversation.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.